Episode 13, My Uncle's House. So my story starts in 2010 when my uncle died and left my father his house in Los Angeles. I lived in the UK all my life and never seriously thought about living anywhere else. At the time of the events I worked in construction, just a manual labourer by trade, but always wanted to make the transition to self-employed. I'd visited Manhattan before, but that was about as much travelling as I had done in the USA. It's a bit like visiting London and saying you've seen the UK, I guess. It's so unrepresentative of the rest of the country, it's unreal. Anyway, my uncle's house was left to my father, as he didn't have any children of his own. My father showed me a picture of the house on Google Maps and asked me if I'd be interested in helping him do some renovations on the place so that he could sell it on. Dad would of course cut me in on the profits. I said yes, and before I knew it, we were on a plane to LAX. The plan had always been to assess the property and enlist some local contractors for anything that we couldn't handle. Everything else we would do by ourselves. I had tasks such as carpentry, plastering and general restoration covered. My dad was an electrician by trade, so between us we were very confident we could quickly add value to the house. We would of course either stay on site until the job was done, or make a second visit if there were larger jobs to be booked in with the local trades. The house itself was located in one of the LA suburbs. Each road had many examples of these large types of wooden exterior house. 3 floors, a porch, and a sort of turret in a Gothic style. Compared to our houses here in the UK, these were like mansions. Externally, it looked a bit run down. It certainly had minimum curb appeal. Broken drain pipes, fallen panelling, and quite a bit of wear and tear. The overgrown garden too seemed to emphasise the place as looking rather derelict. It would be very easy for potential buyers to balk at the idea of even stepping inside. In truth, all of this would be relatively easy to fix. It wouldn't even cost much. It would just take a fair amount of effort. The building itself looked structurally sound on first impression. This had been our main worry. Inside, the house was a bit of a mixed bag. My uncle clearly hadn't been a fan of decorating, as many of the rooms already lay mostly empty and contained their original wallpaper by the looks of it. Work would clearly need doing on various walls that showed a few vertical cracks. Other rooms seemed to be suffering from the effects of mould. Many of the window frames also had signs of rot due to being left so many years without treatment. Walls would need skimming internally and several of the wooden floors would need replacing. The kitchen was just about functional but incredibly outdated, as were the bathrooms. These would certainly benefit greatly from renovation and add the most value to the property. My dad confirmed that it would be best to rewire the entire house as part of the renovation. The existing copper wires were just too old to certify as safe. There was certainly nothing that we couldn't fix between us, but this was certainly a job that would take time and money. It was enough to put any normal buyer off. Only someone with trade knowledge would even have considered the place as it was. It did have some great period features though. Really nice fireplaces, chandeliers that appeared salvageable. We agreed that even the original tiling in the kitchen was worth saving. Satisfied that we could revamp the house, the plan was to stay there for the next month to see how far we got. Dad was retired so had no pressing timeline to complete the work. Nominally we set a schedule of around 3 months for the main work, plus another to resolve any cosmetic issues. That night we stayed upstairs in separate bedrooms. The way that the layout sat was that I took a bedroom on one side. There was a central landing from where there was a connecting bathroom and also doors to 2 other bedrooms. My dad took one of these. We were both still a little jet lagged, so slept pretty well that first night as I recall. We both reported hearing creaking from the roof above us that night though, something else that we would have to check out that week. We started work the very next day. Phase 1 was to basically gut the house of anything that couldn't be salvaged. We ripped down loose partitions, stacked any loose floorboards on the side, and pulled up carpets. Basically, we stripped the place back to a starting position that we could build upon. We must have filled 3 or 4 skips in that very first week. During that first week, I remember that we hadn't touched the attic space. This was accessed by a large hatch in the ceiling of the upstairs landing. You would need a stepladder at the very least to reach it. Anyway, I went up as Dad wasn't great with heights. The hatch opening was the type that you pushed inwards from the perspective of going up there. So I pushed it back, which took a bit of force, stuck my head up and looked around with my flashlight. That place was as musty as hell, but at least it appeared watertight, which was a pleasant discovery. There was no light up there, so I had to rely on just my flashlight beam. This is the point where I'm sure you're all expecting the boogeyman to jump out, or satanic markings left on the wall, or a phantom crying in the corner. Sorry to disappoint you, but there were none of these things. It was simply an old attic. I pulled myself up into the darkness for a better look. The space was dark and quite cavernous. What lagging insulation was there had perished over the decades, leaving many of the floor beams visible, as were the rafters. I'd expected worse in terms of clutter. There were quite a lot of old boxes, some clearly marked army surplus, possibly from World War II. There were also some smaller pieces of furniture, obscuring my view to the end wall. Overall, I reasoned that the attic space could be cleared in just a day. I took a cursory look in some of the boxes, carefully picking my way along a safe path of floorboards that had seen better days. There were some old tin toys, old books, dinner plates, and any number containing what seemed like knickknacks at best. The type that would just collect dust in a house. The only thing of any note I observed was a small metal box containing a rather large family Bible, a wooden crucifix, and some old sepia-coloured photographs of the house from its heyday. My heart then stopped, as I thought I heard a rustle from the far back of the attic. Instantly, my mind's eye thought of a ghost lurking in the corner, as one tends to, rather than the more logical explanation of a pigeon or a squirrel. Anyway, I quickly inspected the rafters and concluded that the place was watertight and sound enough. I'm not easily spooked, but I'll not pretend that I wasn't keen to get out of there. By the end of that week, we'd practically cleared the house, not only from a structural point of view, but items that we knew we wanted rid of. We had casually struck up conversation with several neighbours as they passed by. We had made it known that we were having a yard sale that weekend and everything must go. They were all very helpful and even pointed us to the local Facebook group where we posted a notice for the sale. We made a nice profit on an electronic organ, various vases and various objects from around the house. I'd cleared most of the attic by this stage, but decided to keep the metal box containing the Bible, crucifix and photos out of the sale. They seemed personal to the house. I figured that I could frame the old photo of the house and hang it as a talking piece for the next owner. I put it in the garage for safekeeping and forgot all about it. We were at the stage in the project where we could start building the place back up though. The floors, the walls, the ceilings, work on the windows. Yes, from here it was all the fun stuff. Little did we know though, we were also at the start of a haunting. Now I call it a haunting as that's all I can call it. I've been in any number of old properties and spooky renovation jobs, but never anywhere like this place. I think that pieces of furniture left by people, their smell, the physical marks such as the dents in the woodwork they made in life, all add up to create the illusion that they're still there. But that's all it is, just an illusion that they are still present. What myself and Dad experienced though, this was quite different. We went to bed that night and the first strange things started to happen to us. I was in bed and I heard a thud outside on the landing, followed by silence. Naturally, after a few seconds, I call out to Dad to make sure if he's okay. I got no response. At this point I got up, switched on the bedroom light and walked onto the landing. I found my dad stood there. When I asked him if he was okay, he just said, "Sure." He too had come out to see what the thudding sound was. Initially he had assumed that some equipment must have fallen over. On inspection, neither of us could see anything particularly unusual. We both thought that it must be nothing and went back to bed. We had after all been moving around lots of things all week. It was after this event that we both became more wary of the house. At times we both felt watched, even when we were both together. It was as if a third person was there. It wasn't a nice feeling. It was one of paranoia and suspicion. We both felt much better when we were away from the house, at the timber yard or at the hardware store. The feelings of being watched got so bad we started to look for other explanations. I'd heard that methane, carbon monoxide and even mould could all produce these kinds of reactions. We made all the relevant tests. None of these were present. One day, we started noticing a sort of shadowy person in the house out of the corner of our eyes. We both saw it at different times, mostly upstairs at first, but then later in some of the downstairs rooms. We felt that it was watching us, as it would only ever stand in doorways or be heard in other rooms. There was one night that terrified me. I was in bed and I heard the thud on the landing again. This time though, I heard the distinctive sound of feet running across the wooden floor. I sprang out of the bedroom door. I swear that I saw the back of a dark body disappear around the corner of a door frame at the bottom of the stairs. For sure, it wasn't my dad, as he emerged from his room seconds later and clear punched me in the face. He too had heard the thing on the landing and thought that it was an intruder. That's how real this thing was. To our astonishment, the hatch to the attic above us was open. That's when we knew we had an intruder. Remember, we had stripped the house at this point. There were no places to hide in the walls. Whatever had been watching us had been living in the attic. We stayed up that night and agreed that we must have a squatter in the house. Dad called the local police for assistance. Based on our story, they were confident that our assumptions of a squatter were indeed correct. I left out the suggestion that the thing we had been seeing was a shadow person. 2 local cops logged a report and took a look around the property. They didn't find any evidence of a break-in or habitation other than ourselves. However, they suggested that squatters are often able to hide their tracks, especially in a house this size. If they were in the attic, we really had 2 options: either set up a camera and alarm system, or simply nail the attic shut. We opted for the second option. That next day, I nailed the attic shut with some spare wood that we had left over from the kitchen renovations downstairs. We were now 2 months into the renovation. We had made fantastic time on the project with the help of the local trades. However, the story didn't end there. That night, myself and Dad could hear pacing coming from the attic. We stood in a doorway, listening to it, both of us at the same time. It seemed to scratch at the hatch before pacing again, louder and louder each time. We looked at each other. I called the cops straight away. They arrived promptly and asked me to fetch them a stepladder to the hatch. We stood back as the first cop started to crowbar the sealed hatch off. It's important to note that both cops also heard the scratching and the pacing of heavy footsteps. The second drew their gun as the wood was ripped away. The first cop forcibly spoke to whoever was in the attic to tell them who they were and that we would be coming up. There was no response, just silence. He too pulled his gun and flashlight as he climbed through the hatch. I remember being terrified for him. This is where things get even stranger. His voice called down to his colleague to join him, so she did. They spent nearly half an hour in the attic looking for the person. There was no sign of them whatsoever, nor were there any feasible hiding places. They assured us that they had checked around all of the perimeter, poked at the roofing felt, under the insulation, nothing. It was as if we had made it all up. Both cops were as baffled as us. We could only conclude that they had fled through some unknown hole to the roof outside. It was an answer that none of us found satisfactory. With no apparent crime committed, they could only file a report of attempted break-in. There was little else that they could commit to in their report. That week, the stonemason came to repair the surroundings of several of the fireplaces. Whilst we were out buying paint, we left him to work. Upon returning, he was gone, all of his tools just left on the floor. We assumed that he'd just nipped out for a smoke or to run and get some more equipment. That was until we got a phone call from him. He'd actually fled the house in terror. He explained how he'd seen a hideous dark entity half walk, half glide across the room behind him. He simply downed his tools and ran. The mason wouldn't even come back to the house to pick up his tools. He was that scared of what had happened. Myself and Dad were near the completion of the house now, so decided that we would sell. The fireplaces we could leave as they were after just a simple polish. Any new owner could fix them up if they needed to. It was our last night in the house. We had listed with the local agent and planned to hand over the keys in the morning. The rest of the paperwork we could all handle from the UK. I lay in bed that night thinking of all that we had accomplished. We had added at least 70k to the house, not bad for a few months' work. My final and most disturbing experience came that night though. Exhausted, I was just falling off to sleep. That was when I was aware of the black thing standing in the corner of the room. It stood tall and dark in the shadows. It scared the out of me. I was absolutely terrified to my core as it slowly started to advance towards me. It drifted in a disturbing way, its arms becoming outstretched. The most terrifying part, though, were its eyes. Against a black, featureless shadow of a face, they stared directly into mine. They were white and wide and terrifying. As it got closer, it seemed to approach faster before jumping on the bed next to me. It just stared at me, not even blinking. It then wrapped its cold arm around my paralysed body. Then it was gone. It was as if it never happened. The next thing I knew, Dad was shaking me. We left the house together that morning, dropped off the keys at the agent, and drove up the coast to spend a few days in Santa Barbara before our flight home. It took a few months for the agent to sell the property, despite it looking very presentable. The general feedback from viewings was that the place just wasn't quite right. We'll never know exactly what they meant by that, but I actually don't care too much. We lowered the price several times over the next few months based on the agent's advice. Eventually, the house did sell. We heard that it was to a young couple. We never heard any more after that date. What I do know though is that somewhere in the suburbs of LA is a seriously haunted house. I sometimes wonder if the current owners ever experienced anything like myself and Dad. I looked it up in the listings some time ago and could see that the house had changed hands several times in recent years. It makes me wonder if the entity that I saw had anything to do with this. If you enjoyed this week's paranormal story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more tales of the supernatural and the unexplained. Until next time, my friends, happy hauntings.